He had been standing in the middle of the living room for 2 hours. Not pacing, not searching for anything. Just standing. Blind since birth, returned twice now in a new house with no way of knowing whether this one would last. That was October. By January, the same cat was crossing a snow-dusted garden without hesitation. No wall to follow, no human guiding him. Just a small sound moving ahead of him in the cold morning air. A bell worn by a small golden cat who had decided somewhere along the way that he was her responsibility. Nobody taught her to do it. This is the story of what happened in the months between that stillness and that morning. It is a story about blindness and about all the different forms that sight can take. The town of Stowe, Vermont goes quiet in early autumn in a way that has its own specific weight. The tourists have mostly gone. The summer noise has pulled back like a tide, and what remains is the sound of wind moving through maple trees and the occasional creak of old houses settling into the cold. Margaret Elaine Holloway had lived in that silence for 3 years by the time Moog came into her life. She was 61 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who had spent 32 years teaching second grade in Burlington before taking early retirement the year after her husband David died of a stroke at 58. The house in Stowe had been their plan together. They had bought it as a vacation property in their early 30s. A narrow wood frame house on a half-acre lot with a covered porch and a garden that David had tended with more enthusiasm than skill. The plan had always been to move there properly when they retired, to finally have the slow mornings and long walks they had been promising themselves for decades. David did not make it to retirement. Margaret moved to Stowe anyway because the alternative was staying in the Burlington apartment that still had his coffee mug on the shelf above the sink and his handwriting on the calendar they had never taken down. She told her daughter Caroline that the move was practical. Smaller mortgage, smaller bills, quieter life. Caroline did not push back, but she called every Sunday without fail, and Margaret knew she was being monitored in the gentle, worried way that adult children monitor parents who are grieving and living alone. Margaret had never thought of herself as a cat person. She had grown up with dogs, and David had been allergic to most things with fur. But in the second autumn after his death, she had found herself walking into the Lamoille County Humane Society on a Tuesday afternoon, without any clear plan, the way people sometimes do things when they have too many empty hours and not enough reasons to fill them. She had walked past several cats before she reached the enclosure at the far end of the room. The card on the cage read Moog. Male, approximately 4 years. Congenital bilateral blindness. Returned twice. Requires patient, experienced owner. The cat inside was not doing anything. He was sitting in the corner of the enclosure with the specific stillness of an animal that has learned not to invest in its surroundings. He did not look toward her when she stopped at the cage. He had no way of knowing she was there until she spoke. She said his name once low. His ears moved. Just that. She filled out the paperwork before she allowed herself to think too carefully about whether it was a good idea. The first week was harder than she had expected. Dr. Susan Fairbanks, the veterinarian at the clinic on Route 100 who had been treating Stowe's animals for 20 years, had given Margaret a thorough briefing before she brought Moog home. Keep the furniture in the same positions, at least while he's mapping the space. Use your voice before you touch him so he's never startled. Let him move at his own pace. Don't carry him from room to room. He needs to build his own map. Margaret followed the instructions carefully. She touched nothing. She announced herself every time she entered a room. She left the radio on at low volume so the house was never completely silent. Because silence, Dr. Fairbanks had explained, was disorienting for a blind cat in a way that would not apply to a sighted one. But Moog did not map anything that first week. He ate when the food was directly in front of him. He used the litter box, which she had placed close to where he slept. He did not explore. He stood in the middle of rooms and waited as though he was accustomed to waiting for whatever came next, without expectation or urgency. Margaret called Caroline on the Sunday of that first week and told her she thought she had made a mistake. She described Moog standing in the living room in the early morning, that absolute stillness, the sense that he had already decided not to try. She said she did not know how to reach an animal that had stopped expecting to be reached. Caroline was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Maybe he just needs more time than you're used to giving." Margaret did not say what she was thinking, which was that she was not sure she had that kind of patience anymore, that David had always been the patient one, that she was better at doing things than at waiting for them. Bitzu arrived 9 days after Moog. She was not planned. Margaret's neighbor, a 73-year-old man named Harold Creed, who had lived 4 houses down for as long as Margaret could remember, had died in his sleep in late September. Harold had lived alone and had no family that anyone knew of. He had 1 cat. The cat was 2-year-old female with short pale golden fur and an expression that suggested she found most situations faintly beneath her. The woman from the town clerk's office had knocked on Margaret's door holding a cardboard carrier and looking apologetic. She said Harold had left a note on his kitchen table, apparently written some time ago, asking that his cat be given to the woman down the road who seemed kind. Margaret brought the carrier inside without fully deciding to. The cat's name, according to Harold's note, was Bitzu. The introduction between Bitzu and Moog was not dramatic. Margaret had expected hissing territory disputes, the complicated choreography of animals negotiating space. What she got was stranger. Bitzu walked directly to the center of the room, saw Moog standing in his usual place, and sat down 6 feet away from him. She did not approach him. She did not retreat. She simply sat and looked at him, with that flat, assessing expression she had apparently brought with her from Harold's house. Moog's nose lifted. He turned his head slightly in her direction. Neither of them made a sound. For the next several days, this was how they existed together, close enough to know the other was there, far enough to maintain the careful distance of 2 creatures who had each in their own way learned to be cautious about closeness. Margaret watched them and thought about Harold, who had trusted her without ever saying so directly. The note on his kitchen table, written at some unknown point in the past, had banked on the possibility of her kindness before anyone had asked for it. She found this unbearably affecting and could not have said exactly why. It would be another 3 weeks before she understood what Bitzu had been doing during those quiet days of watching. It was Dr. Fairbanks who suggested the bell. Margaret had brought Moog in for his first checkup 6 weeks after adopting him, and she had mentioned, partly out of frustration, that he still moved very little on his own. "He eats, he sleeps, he stands," she said. "He doesn't explore. He doesn't seem interested in learning where anything is." Dr. Fairbanks had seen this before in blind cats who had been through multiple failed adoptions. The mapping instinct was still there, she explained, but the motivation had been worn down. He had tried to learn spaces before and then been removed from them. Eventually, the effort starts to feel pointless. She suggested attaching a small bell to the collar of the other cat if possible as an environmental sound anchor. A consistent moving audio point that a blind cat could use as a reference, the way a person with impaired vision might track a companion by the sound of their footsteps. It would not fix anything by itself, she said, but it might give him an address to walk toward. Margaret bought a small brass bell from the pet supply store in Morrisville on her way home. It made a thin, clear sound, not loud, but precise. She threaded it onto Bitzu's collar that same evening. Bitzu shook her neck once, twice, with the expression of a cat filing a formal complaint, and then appeared to accept it as a permanent condition of her existence. Moog heard it from across the room. His head turned, his ears lifted. He took 1 step in the direction of the sound, then stopped. For the rest of that evening, he did nothing further with the information, but his head kept tracking whenever Bitzu moved, following the bell through the walls, through the kitchen, up the hallway. The stillness was the same, but it was no longer empty. Over the following week, Margaret watched Bitzu do something she could not account for and did not try to name. Bitzu began to slow down. Not all the time, and not dramatically, but noticeably specifically when she was passing through a space where Moog was present. Where before she had moved with the swift, fluid economy of a sighted cat who knew every inch of her territory, she now adjusted her pace when Moog was nearby. She would pass through a room, pause near him, shift direction, move again. The bell rang in short, deliberate intervals. Margaret would not have called it intentional if she had only seen it once. But she watched it happen across 3 days, across different rooms, different times of day. And gradually she stopped looking for another explanation. On the 9th day, after the bell was introduced, Moog followed it. He was in the kitchen when Bitzu passed through the doorway into the hallway the bell sounding its clean note in the corridor. Moog's head lifted. He stood for a moment. Then he walked through the doorway after her. He went carefully. His whiskers extended his body low and close to the floor. But he went. Margaret was standing at the kitchen counter, and she put down her coffee mug very carefully and held her breath. Bitzu had stopped at the end of the hallway near the base of the stairs. Moog reached her. He stood close enough that his nose almost touched her flank. Bitzu turned her head and looked at him for a moment, then turned away and sat down. They stayed there for several minutes before Moog retraced his steps back to the kitchen. But the next morning he followed the bell again, and the morning after that. Dr. Fairbanks called it significant when Margaret described it. She said she had recommended the bell as an environmental aid, a passive sound source, and that what Margaret was describing was categorically different. She used the phrase self-directed behavioral adaptation and then paused and said that even that clinical language fell short of what was happening. Margaret appreciated the honesty. By November, Bitzu had extended what Margaret privately called the route. She had begun leading through the full length of the house when Moog was following through the living room, the dining area, the back hallway, the small sunroom at the rear of the house. She would stop at the 2 steps down from the kitchen to the sunroom, ringing the bell with a small shake of her head before descending. And Moog had learned this signal with a consistency that made Margaret's throat tighten every time she saw it. He would pause at the top of the steps, feel for the edge with one paw, and then descend carefully, always correctly. Bitzu always waited at the bottom. The winter that year came early and hard. By the last week of November, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the garden was locked under a thin gray crust of ice. Moog could not go outside safely, and on the afternoons, when the cold pressed against the windows and the light went flat and thin, he would lie on the window seat in the sunroom with Bitzu beside him, and Margaret would watch them from the doorway and think about all the ways creatures find to be close to each other when proximity is the only warmth available. She had started filming them, not with any intention initially, just her phone propped against a mug on the kitchen counter, capturing a few minutes of Bitzu leading through the hallway with Moog behind her. She had sent it to Caroline one Sunday evening, not as a story, just as something she thought her daughter would want to see. Caroline had forwarded it to a friend. That friend had posted it somewhere. By the following Thursday, a producer from an animal interest website had emailed Margaret asking for an interview. By the following Monday, a researcher from the Animal Behavior Department at the University of Vermont had called and asked whether Margaret would be willing to allow a formal behavioral study of Bitzu's navigational signaling. The researcher was professional and thorough, and clearly genuinely interested. She spoke about mirror neurons and interspecies attunement, and the documented but still poorly understood capacity of some domestic cats to modify behavior in response to the perceived limitations of a companion animal. She explained that what Bitzu was doing was not without precedent in the literature, but that the consistency and apparent intentionality of the behavior made this a potentially significant case. Margaret listened to the full explanation before she asked what a formal study would require. The researcher described a series of observation sessions, ideally in a controlled environment, with some sessions at the university and some in the home. Margaret said she needed to think about it. She called Dr. Fairbanks that afternoon and described the conversation. Dr. Fairbanks said it was Margaret's decision, but that she should consider how Moog, in particular, would respond to environmental disruption at a point where he was finally beginning to move with something approaching confidence. Margaret called the researcher back the following morning and declined. She said she was grateful for the interest, but that what was happening in her house was not a study. It was just 2 cats figuring out how to live together, and she did not think she had the right to interrupt that for the sake of documentation. The researcher was gracious about it. Margaret put the phone down and stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the bell move through the house. She had started keeping a small notebook on the kitchen counter, the kind she had used for grocery lists and appointment reminders, and she had begun writing down what she observed. Not as research and not with any audience in mind. Just the dates, the times what Bitzu did, what Moog did in response. She was not sure why the record felt important. Perhaps it was the teacher in her, the habit of documentation, the belief that things observed carefully are more real than things only felt. Perhaps it was simpler than that, the need to have proof for herself that what she was seeing was actually happening. The notebook filled faster than she expected. She began a second one in the third week of November. By December, the roots had extended all the way to the back garden when the weather allowed. Bitzu would pause at the back door, turn to face the interior of the house, and ring the bell twice in quick succession, and Moog would come from wherever he had been resting and follow her outside. The garden was harder than the house. The surfaces changed. The sounds reflected differently off the fence, and the shed, the wind complicated everything. Moog went more carefully outside, his nose closer to the ground, his whiskers doing the work that his eyes could not. But Bitzu had learned to account for this, too. She went at a different pace in the garden, slower with more pauses, and rang the bell more often, at closer intervals, as if she understood that the audio landscape outside required more frequent anchoring. Margaret stood at the back door watching them on a cold afternoon in December, the bare apple tree at the far end of the garden casting thin shadows on the frozen ground. Harold Creed had written a note and left it on his table without telling anyone. All the arrangements that get made between creatures who have decided to take responsibility for each other happen the same way, without announcement, without ceremony. They rarely look like the important things they turn out to be. That evening, she called Caroline and told her about the garden. She described Bitzu pausing at the door, the double-ring Moog appearing from the hallway. She described the way they crossed the frost-stiff grass, one leading one, following neither of them, appearing to find anything remarkable about the arrangement. Caroline was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mom, are you doing okay?" Margaret said she was. She said she was more than okay, actually, and that she had been for a while, and she was not sure when exactly that had happened. But she wanted Caroline to stop worrying as much as she was worrying. Caroline said that would require a personality transplant. Margaret laughed. It was a real laugh, not the kind she had been producing in the first year after David died, the kind that was technically correct, but felt assembled from separate pieces. After she hung up, she stood at the kitchen window in the dark and watched the garden where nothing stirred and felt the weight of the house around her. Its sounds and silences, the low, steady presence of two animals somewhere down the hallway, and understood that the thing she had not been looking for had been building itself into her days without her permission. She did not examine this too carefully. She went to bed and slept the way she had not slept in 3 years. The first sign was how she was eating, or rather how she wasn't. Bitzu had always eaten with the focused efficiency of a cat who treated meals as serious business, but in the second week of November, she began leaving food in the bowl. Not all of it at first, a little, then more. By the fourth day, she was barely eating at all, and when Margaret picked her up to check, she could feel the difference already. The slight looseness under the skin, the way her body did not resist being held with its usual mild impatience. Dr. Fairbanks saw her the next morning. The diagnosis was a severe kidney infection. Not uncommon in cats Bitzu's age, but serious enough to require immediate hospitalization and intravenous fluids. Possibly 5 days, Dr. Fairbanks said. Maybe more depending on how she responds. Margaret drove home from the clinic through a silence that had a texture she recognized. She unlocked the front door and stood in the hallway for a moment before going inside. The house was different without the bell. Not quieter exactly. The refrigerator hummed, a branch knocked against the kitchen window in the wind. The old baseboard heaters ticked. But the point she had been orienting around without knowing it was gone, and its absence had a shape. Moog was in the living room. He was standing in the middle of the floor, not near the window, not near his bed, not near the food bowl. In the center of the room, in the place he had stood on the first day, when he did not yet know where anything was. Margaret sat down on the sofa and looked at him. He did not look toward her. His ears worked through the silence, searching for a sound that was not there. She had not anticipated this. She had understood intellectually that Bitzu had become important to Moog's movement through the house. But she had thought of this as practical, a matter of navigation and orientation. She had not considered what it would look like when the sound simply stopped. That first evening was very long. She kept the radio on, walked through the house talking to Moog in the low, continuous voice that Dr. Fairbanks had recommended from the beginning, made sure his food was where it always was, sat near him on the floor for a while without touching him. He ate a little. He eventually found his bed and lay down. The way he crossed the room was different from the way he had crossed it for months. It was the older way, the careful, provisional way of a cat who is not sure the geography will hold. That night, Margaret sat in the kitchen after Moog had settled. She had not realized how much of what had changed in that house over the past several months had been held together by a small brass bell on a golden cat's collar. She had not realized she had stopped being lonely until she noticed it again now. The 5 days without Bitzu were the slowest of the 3 years since David had died. Grief has its own logic, and loss does not always scale proportionally to what seems important from the outside. She had not understood that the bell had become a coordinate she was using too, not just Moog. By the 3rd day, she understood quite clearly that she had been less alone than she realized, and for longer. Moog navigated the hallway and the sunroom, in the old way, one paw finding each edge before the next step. The ease of recent months was gone, replaced by the deliberate caution of an animal that has learned a thing and then had the learning temporarily taken away. On the 5th morning, Dr. Fairbanks called to say that Bitzu was responding well and could be collected that afternoon. Margaret drove to the clinic in weather that had turned gray and cold, a steady, fine sleet on the mountain road. When she brought the carrier inside and set it on the kitchen floor and opened the door, Bitzu walked out carefully and stood in the kitchen with the stillness of a cat reassembling her understanding of a familiar space. The bell on her collar rang once as she shook her head. A single clean note. From the living room came a sound low, almost below the threshold of hearing, and then the sound of weight shifting of paws on the floor. Moog came through the doorway. Not quickly, not the urgent approach of a distressed animal, just steadily following the note with the quality of attention he had built over months of listening for exactly this. He stopped when he reached her. He stood close nose near her flank and was still. Bitzu did not move away. She was still weak, and it showed in how she held herself. But she turned her head once toward him, and then looked forward again, and they stood together in the kitchen in the late afternoon light, while the sleet tapped against the window. Dr. Fairbanks came by 2 days later for a home visit. She found them in the sunroom, Bitzu, in her usual position on the window seat, Moog pressed close beside her. She stood in the doorway for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said in a careful voice that in 30 years of veterinary work, she had learned to be precise about what she observed, and reluctant to read more into animal behavior than the evidence supported. She said she was finding that discipline harder than usual to maintain today. Margaret said she understood the feeling. Bitzu recovered slowly over the following 2 weeks. Her movements were cautious at first, the bell ringing less frequently, shorter routes, longer rests. And through all of it, Moog stayed close. He did not lead out through the house in his usual pattern. Instead, he stayed near her, resting in the same spaces, rising when she rose, settling when she settled. It was simply companionship of the most ordinary kind, 2 animals occupying the same space because that space was where the other one was. On a morning in early December, about 3 weeks after Bitzu had come home, Margaret woke to the sound of the bell moving through the house. The old rhythm, the familiar pattern Bitzu. Leading through the hallway to the kitchen, the small measured pauses, the double ring at the top of the sunroom steps. Margaret lay in bed and listened without getting up. She had woken to this sound many times without registering what it was. Now she lay still and let it be what it was. Outside, the first real snow of winter was falling on the garden. Through the bedroom window, she could see the white settling on the fence posts and the bare branches of the apple tree David had planted the first summer they owned the house. From somewhere in the house came the sound of a small brass bell, and behind it, quiet and steady, the sound of a cat following. Margaret lay still and thought about Harold Creed writing a note at his kitchen table and leaving it there for whenever it was needed. She thought about the first morning she had stood in the doorway of the shelter, and a cat in a corner had turned his ears toward the sound of his own name. All the ways that things begin without announcing themselves as beginnings. There was nothing she needed to do. The house had its sounds, and they were enough.